Hello and welcome to the Communication Solution Podcast with Casey Jackson and John Gilbert. I'm your host, Danielle Cantin. Here at the Institute for Individual and Organizational Change, otherwise known as IFIOC, we love to talk about communication, we love to talk about solutions, and we love to talk about providing measurable results for individuals, organizations, and the communities they serve. Welcome to the communication solution that will change your world.
Hello, this is Casey Jackson, back for another communication solution. And I've got a guest on here, Falin Wilson. He is a counselor at OnTrack Academy, working with youth in the school system, an alternative school. And Falin's been through a few trainings with me, and he's one of those guys that will come up a break and come up after the class is over and ask really pointed questions and wants to know the answer. And so I said, Falin, would you come on to the podcast and ask some of those questions that you'd like to ask in training? So good to have you here, Falin.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. So they were always never meant to be pointed, but I definitely wanted to know some of those answers.
Yes. So what's been your intrigue? Because you do, even in the more recent training that we had, I can see your brain in the room really genuinely doing application and processing it. What draws you into motivational interviewing or the concepts and get your brain to start to chew on it more? Because I watch you process it in the training, and trying to integrate it more. I mean, what's going through your head? I mean, why does this integrate for you? Why does this resonate with you?
I think when I was in graduate school, we were learning about it. I thought it was kind of interesting, but it never really caught my attention. And then we went so Spokane Public Schools offered a MI training through you, and I was like, okay, I'll try it. And the way that you approached the whole MI aspect, kind of like a brain, like a view of the brain, and kind of breaking it down that way was probably the most helpful I've ever seen it. And that was really intriguing to me because you said that it's a conversation. It's just like you're having a conversation with somebody, right? And you're tuning into what they're saying, and then you're trying to navigate from that. And I found that to be like the most fascinating thing ever, just because like you're working with the brain and you're trying to figure out where it's at and all this processing. And I think the more that I continue to learn about it, I was like, there's this awesome thing that Casey's doing. I just don't know how to implement it. So the second time I came back and you kind of like walked us through more of like some of that advanced and then kind of going over that like beginner stuff again, I found that really helpful because it kind of just solidified like it really is a conversation and you can do it in a few minutes. And even though it's really hard sometimes, like anybody can build these skills, but I think that
Yeah.
we're so bad at communicating. I feel that we really are. And I was like, well, I would love to just learn better ways of being like a better person and like better communicator.
That's great. It's interesting too because I've heard this often that, especially kind of the college version or grad school version of motivational meaning, doesn't catch, like, there's something there, but then people don't tend to gravitate towards it as much. What I hear in a lot of my trainings, and so I think once you get into the real world and you're working in the real world, you can start to see some of that crosswalk between some of the core constructs, and then look at it as just kind of, how does this work? My favorite thing is always based in reality. Like, based in reality, how would this really work? I mean, you work with kids that struggle, with in an alternative, amazing wraparound high school. I know that program fairly well. I've done training for OnTrack. What I think of is, when you're in those conversations, what are some things that you see almost cross reference between, like, wow, this is a moment, like I can see now from what I've learned, or the way that I'm, this new vantage point I'm looking at it from. What do you notice with either, the colleagues you work with or with the students you work with, things you're starting to notice more?
Well, I'm using MI.
Yeah. Or opportunities
Mm.
too, that you missed opportunities, like after the fact.
There was this really fun one. I was working with a student who uses substances, right? And I had asked that question at the end of the seminar. I was just like, how do you like you get them to wrap their arms around it, or you wrap their arms around their tree tighter, right? Yeah, because like you want to double down on the like sustained talk before they do. And
Yes.
I was like, it seems so counterintuitive, right? But like the way
Yeah.
you had talked about it was so good. So I was like, okay, like what the hell? Like I'll give it a shot. So I was like, okay. So I go in with my client and I'm like, you know that you're never gonna like, you know that you're not gonna use, or sorry, you know that you're gonna continue to use and that you're not gonna quit. Like, what would that even look like? You know that you're not though. And she was like, I know that I'm not. And then she gave me the solution. Like she was like, that could look like this. And then the example she gave was like cutting down to smoking like 2 to 3 times a week instead of every day. So I was like, oh my gosh, like that's awesome. Um, and then sometimes I found it kind of difficult to like double down often. So like using substances, right? I can be like, oh, you know that you're not going to stop using. Like, what would that even look like? And like wrap their
Right.
arms tighter. But I don't know other scenarios where like I could try to apply that. Or I guess I struggle with trying to identify them because I see the potential and how helpful it is, right? Because
Yes.
you're getting the brain to engage in change talk. Um, I guess I'm just trying to figure out like how else I can apply that. Like those would be some of the missed opportunities, if that makes sense.
It does. I think with the population you work with, the thing I think of too is at least what I hear quite a bit about and with youth that I work with is just around sex as well too. Or, just some of those situations. What you're thinking when I think about it through the MI lens and how to make it an organic conversation that doesn't feel like you're trying to use a technique, you know, and you can see how organic it sounds when it's like, you're never going to stop smoking weed. You're never going to stop using. So that's yours. But if you did, what might it change here? It's that part just it allows the sustained talk to feel so heard and understood that it just opens the door to allow change to talk come in because when I think of youth, yeah, I think of anybody when I think of youth, they've got the other side that goes through their head. If they're laying in bed at night just thinking about their situation, they know both sides of the equation or have entertained both sides of the equation. So just like you said, let them double down on their stuck talk. So I think about that with sexual situations. You're going to continue to have sex. That's just not going to stop. But then there's this other party that's thinking, what would be different if you weren't doing that? Does that make sense? So, I mean, it's almost any topic that you're dealing with youth, anything that they tend to be overly invested in. And honestly, Fallon, for me, when I think that strategy with youth, as soon as I can feel my writing reflex clicking in, like I'm never going to stop smoking weed, or no, I'm going to keep having sex, or I'm going to keep doing this, or I'm going to keep doing that, or I'm going to keep doing this, that when my writing reflex wants to try to counterbalance it with my narrative, that's when I tend to think of that particular technique of being able to just go, okay, take a deep breath, lean into theirs even harder, give them that 100%, and say, since that's yours 100%, what would it look like if? Knowing that you're not going to, but what would it look like if? I don't know if that helps, but what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it does help because it and I think that's why I love motivational interviewing so much because it really is just a dialogue. Like you are listening because you said like if you just can quiet your brain for a minute and listen to a conversation and trust that you're going to hear what they're saying and focus on the like resistant talk, change talk, sustained talk, and like identify those, it's going to be easier for you to navigate those conversations. And so I think even sitting here, like we're talking about doubling down, like if I'm with a client and I double down, right, like I can double down on anything, like beat them to that punch and then offer that, like offer
What
their
if?
brain yeah, exactly, to engage in that change talk um, is super helpful because it's applicable to literally anything, like any
Yeah.
conversation. Like, I mean, there has to be ambiguity, like you said, or
Yeah.
ambivalence, but yeah, I think it's just so cool when you're able to like, oh my goodness, like there's a person who's struggling with identifying something. I can help them figure this out without
Yes.
ever influencing like my opinions on them, like my writing
Yes.
reflex. Yeah.
Well, and that's what I like about the thing that clicks for you in terms of just being fascinated with healthy or functional communication. That is what I get so intrigued with this is like, how do we have conversations where I don't have to manipulate, or I'm not trying to play them, or I just want to help their brain function more effectively. And I think that's some of that structure of MI that you resonate with. And it's not just the technique side of things, because that technique side tends to go sideways in personal relationships when you try to use technique. But when you are just genuinely present with someone, stepping inside their worldview, looking at where you can see the potential for ambivalence that exists, and then just thinking, what is their brain hanging on to? What does their brain want to let go of? But it requires that foundational, genuine empathy to be inside their brain and get a gut sense of it, instead of being kind of fishbowl observer and trying to help them fix it, which is what, again, most people get paid to do in our field. Is, we see the problem, we assess it, we ask a bunch of questions, and then we give them the plan that they need to follow if they're going to get better.
Yeah. And you said like questions put stress on the brain, and it like really stuck with me because I was like, right, you want to use questions very intentionally if you ever do use
Yes.
them.
Yes.
But there was something that we had done, like we had done the MI training. The next day when I went into session, I was just like, I want to see if I can stay in MI like the entire time, like the whole 15 minutes, and really challenge
Yes.
myself. And
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, there were parts where I'm like, okay, where are we going? Right.
Yes.
But there were other parts where like I could watch her self correct, like, all right,
Yes.
hitting on the key parts of that conversation. And at the very end of it, she had said this and it just blew my mind. But she was like, I want to be successful. And I was like, you want to be successful. Like, that's the top of your mountain. Like, that's where you want to go. And like, you are doing what you need to do right now to be successful. You're changing your classes. You are taking care of yourself because that's so important to you. And she was like, yes. Like, and that I just look like I'm excited to come in and do that because like, it means that I'm getting closer to doing something that I want to do. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like my mind was just like blew up.
It is.
Cause I
It
didn't,
is almost. Go ahead.
oh, I was like, cause I just didn't, I like, all I did was reflected back or not reflected, right. But like high accurate empathy moving along into like the you statements and the double-sided reflections.
It's it. And I think I love listening to you talk about it, because it just goes back to that reset button of some of the basics in motivational interviewing. You're helping the person walk through their own thought process. And I know that at face value, people think, well, what am I supposed to do as the professional? Like, you're just paying me to help them work through their own thought process that they already have. Like, that doesn't seem legit. But when they walk away and their brain is clearer and cleaner about their target behavior and what their values are, that's different than when they came into the session in the first place. That's an intervention. They're clear about who they are, they're clear about their own internal struggle, and they're getting more clear about what their ultimate destination is, and which helps their brain start to think of a plan of how they're going to get there. And you still haven't interjected yourself into the equation yet. That's mastery. I mean, that's not easy to do. That takes so much self-discipline.
And like there was multiple times where I was like, it would be so easy to intervene, right, and insert myself into the equation, but like that's not helpful because I forget who says it, but it's either the Rogers paradox or another one, right? But people only listen to what they have to say. Um, and so just like really clinging onto that with like motivational interviewing, but like I often have to remind myself is like there has to be um, ambivalence because like right if there's no ambivalence then you can't use mi because
Yeah,
you're
right,
not sorting anything. But I think right where like that conversation comes in is people are like, well, when do I use it, right? Like, oh, you can use it in this or this and this, but like they often might forget like I have to use it when I hear ambivalence, because if somebody's mind is already decided, like I could see how you could potentially try to rock the boat, right, what we were
yes.
talking about to see if we can pivot. But if they're like very set in that, then it's back to high accurate empathy. So really identifying where they're at in that process. Um, Super neat, super helpful, super effective. It's just because I think it provides a segue into any modality that you need to use, which
Yes.
is like such a cool part.
That's what I appreciate too, of those dots you connect, because I like looking at motivation in conjunction with other evidence-based practices. And I just think from what you've just articulated, if the person is not defensive, if they're not dug in, if they have some internal struggle going on, and now, like what you just said, when you hear things like, well, I do want to be successful, or you hear the change talk start to come through, your brain starts to prep itself for how could we catalyze this and move to a more positive outcome, which means we need to listen then. What other skills or strategies do I know could be effective if I have a brain that's not arguing or on the defensive? There's other skills and maybe we start to do some DBT or some CBT, or there's other interventions then that can help them be successful now that their mouth and their brain is going, I want to be successful, I want to move forward, I wish some of this would go away, I want to be, I want to pass my classes, I want to be able to get on my house, I want to be able to get my own place. Like as soon as you hear change talk, the hardest part though when we hear change talk is our writing reflex just jumps every time. Like when they're hyper defensive and aggressive towards us, our writing reflex jumps. When we see them struggling in their ambivalence, our writing reflex jumps because we want to save them. Then when they give us change talk, it's like, oh my gosh, let's work on this, I've got some things you can do. Then our writing reflex jumps again. So it's so hard to keep the reins on the writing reflex because almost at every corner our fixed brain wants to jump in and help people.
Yeah, and I mean, like thinking about counselors in general, like mental health counselors, therapists, like, I mean, we're going to see little bits of improvement, right, over a long period of time. But at the very end of the day, when they go home, we're never really going to see like what kind of production they get outside of what we do in session, right? Like we can talk about
Yeah.
what that looks like and how it happened. But once they complete therapy and they go on, like, I don't know what that looks like. And so, right, we want that instant gratification of like, oh, like I've helped you so much. Like, I just want to
Yes.
see you succeed. And then it's like our writing reflex kicks in and now we're like off the path, because maybe they had a bad week and now they're back a couple steps and then you've got to start back over. But like our brains just want to jump to the end because it's like, I've seen you where you could have been, where you were. Like, let's just get back there. It's super easy. And they're like, no, but I'm stuck right here.
That's it. And I think it's so hard because I think where my frustration, why I get so lean so heavily into motivational interviewing, is because I watch so many professionals do the thing that undoes the work. So it's like, we'll just try this. Why don't we just go talk to your teacher together? Why don't we go do this? Like, let's just do this. And they're like, no, I don't want to. It's like, come on, let's just. It's like, and then they turn around and blame the client because they don't know how to use communication to engage the brain and behavior more effectively. And that's where I just get my own writing reflex gets triggered. That's like, wow, it's just so often it's that the professional doesn't have the mindfulness and the strategy and the skill set to use language effectively to engage this human brain more effectively. That's where my obsession always grows in terms of just professional accountability. If we know we have a technology and the data shows how effective it is, and then we continue to blame the client or the patient for the outcomes, it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's where my writing reflects just like, hey, it's out there. We may not know it. We may not understand it. We may not have been trained in it. That's totally fine. But that's not because of the client. Listen, literally, if we walk through the metrics of the language, it is predictable and probable that the client or the patient is going to say these things because of what you just said. Not because that is the wholly where their brain is at. It's because how you're shaping language. And to me, the potency of that is just fascinating.
Well, and it's insane because like we all want to be the authors of our own story, right? Like we love being
Yes.
the center of attention. Like every person, I believe that every person wants that. And so, right, like when the client's like, well, I don't want to do that, right? There's your resistance talk. But instead of
Yes.
identifying that, we go right into, well, like it's super easy. Like I'd be there right with you. Like we'd be able to do this together. No, 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 like it'll be okay, right? And so like we want to help. We're putting our needs in front of theirs, right? Becoming the center of the attention rather than focusing back on them and shifting. And so that's really hard, especially when we have a lot of other things in life that we don't get the attention from, like loved ones, family, right? And so yeah,
Yes.
it takes a lot of self-awareness to be able to continually stay in that like MI zone and then pivot into different modalities. And that when you identify, oh, there's resistance or something has come up, right? Bounce back through because that's or back to MI just because that's the communication. And like, right, it's like a salsa. It's like one step at a time. You're going back and forth, and like that's really hard to do and juggle. Um, But I think if we learn that super well, then we can have a better way of identifying, right? Like that language, we can use better language to like navigate people's problems and help them identify what's going on in their life and how they want to fix it, rather than being like, this is how I think you should fix it, you know?
Exactly. Well, and I think when you what you'd said earlier and you connect that, it makes so much sense. When we look at our own narratives and we want to be the heroes in our own stories, and if we're not getting that in our social lives or our family lives as much as a professional, as the clinician, then you do want to get credit for being a good therapist. Oh, my clients respect me, they like me, they lean on me, they rely on me. I've helped so many of them. When our identity becomes the helper, and if they would just listen to me, and I've helped so many people, if that becomes your primary narrative, then you have to help people to have some sense of positive self-worth. Is I'm that confidence, or in our profession. And our profession, our confidence is, the more experts we are, the more we know, the more initials we have after our name, the more credibility we have in behavioral health and healthcare. So it's so interesting that you're surrendering your whole expertise and personhood from an educational perspective and even an experiential perspective, and you're starting with the other person's narrative first, and then covering. I love what you said when she said, I want to be successful, and you're like, oh, I can't believe she just said that, because it's not where the conversation started. It's like that narrative is what you're working with, is that person-centered narrative. And then you start to evoke or elicit, what would that look like from you? What supports would you need? What would your first step be? Then it's just like, now you've got this forward momentum towards the narrative as they write it, towards her version of what success would look like for her. And that's just like, wow, that's just, you're kind of flipping the game a little bit there. And that's I think where MI is such a fascinating construct to work with.
Well, and like when we have conversations with people, you notice that, like, right, we go off of the last thing that we just said, but notice that you tied it back to an earlier piece in the conversation to kind of restart like what like the main purpose of that conversation was. So like when she was talking, I think at one point we started talking about the movie Trolls, right? And I don't know how we got that far, but then I was able to kind of correct a little bit about like it's so important to you that like you take time to enjoy things that you want so that way you can be successful, instead of like parroting her trying to find that like way of getting her back up on that balance beam. And then she did it, right? And then she kind of stayed with that. But being able to identify, like, well, not identify, but trust ourselves in, like, okay, like just because they are right here in this conversation, like maybe I can go back a few steps and try to get them to get back on this, right? And take that path of like slowing down and then trying to like recourse the conversation, rather than just being like, all right, where are we going every time they finish a sentence? Because like that's not our job. Our job is to help them figure out whatever they're struggling on. Like they can talk about things that they like, but like ultimately, like you just want to be successful and keep tying that back. And
That's
like their
exactly it.
brain will be like, it's so important that they just keep bringing it back up. And they're like, I do want to be successful. Like this is how I could do that, or this is how I could do that.
Well, and this is where that movement from empathy moves into focus, because if you keep focusing on the top of the mountain, or the ultimate destination, that pinnacle, the peak, and keep saying, yeah, you're stuck in the woods over here, or yeah, you tripped over that rock, or yeah, you're kind of wandering through this woods over here. We try to fix all those situations, and then people are with us forever, or they just, or it feels like they never making progress. But in an MI brain, when you are so focused, it's always, no matter what the content is, it's that reorientation to the top of the mountain, and you just want to be successful. And I think that's such a great reset button for MI practitioners, because even when you start getting caught in the content, you can take a couple of deep breaths, get your brain pulled out of the content, and go, you know what? And you just want to be successful, or you're just trying to find your way through this, or you just want to find a resolution to all this. You just wish things were better. Finding change talk is not that hard if you can go to that level of just going, people just are tired of being stuck, and they're struggling in their own life. They wish it was better. And as soon as you start to focus on that, you're focusing on change talk, and it allows you that pathway up to the top of the mountain. So
And I firmly believe that like we can't really help people by just addressing their problems, right? Like that's not helpful. Like we need to address like self-esteem, self-confidence, self-efficacy, right? And like by reinforcing all of those, like we build a better foundation. Like we lay a lot more rebarb and concrete and like these like really
yes,
good solid structures that when they leave, they can apply that elsewhere, rather than being like, like, all right, this is how you have like a single conversation with somebody to like, have a better outcome or like address this. And like, those are important pieces, but without that self, right, without them having that top of the mountain, they're never going to know what they want to do.
That's it. And Fallon, that's why I've added more of the brain science into it, is because I think that rebar and that scaffolding and the concrete is, you want to help them build that elevator or the pathway to their success or to their executive functioning, where the brain is just functioning more effectively, instead of them always listening to the expert telling them how to live their life. Because research shows that doesn't have a lot of sustainability to it, no matter who the expert is. There just doesn't have as much sustainability as when the person starts to define it for themselves and develops a thought process or a pathway in their brain that becomes one that they travel on readily. And the more readily they travel on that thought process, which is more success based or solution focused in a motivationally based approach, that's where you're building that sense of self efficacy. That's where, as they start to build that infrastructure, there's less dependency, because they're building a problem solving scaffolding inside of their own brain. And that problem solving scaffolding isn't based in trauma, it's based in solution and values. And that is just where the game starts to change significantly.
Yeah, and I think when you bring it back to that brain science, that's the part that, like, I remember when we were in class, right? You have the neural pathways, and the more often those neural pathways, well, one are like first off created, but then like continually reinforced, so that myelin sheath that protects it. The more
Yes.
you use it, that highway builds, it just goes faster and faster. So now when you have that first thought, it immediately goes to executive functioning. Um, and so as you were talking and like bringing up all these great points, I'm just like, that's why I kept clicking, because I was like, we're building these like these super highways in their brain. Like maybe it's just like a dirt path, and then it's like a road, and then now it's a freeway, and now it's like a super freeway, and now it's like a bullet train, right? Like
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
upgraded it every time, and it's just like, oh my gosh, like your brain needs to learn how to navigate these on its own. And if people are always stepping in and doing it for you or challenging you, right, you're going to be a little bit more in the back of your mind rather than up in executive functioning. So it's like when we reinforce self, we reinforce the ability to make your own decisions.
Well, it's interesting, Fallon, when you say that, because I have all these thoughts that are clicking in, because I'm studying and reading the latest the latest for me on brain science that a lot of narratives haven't caught up with. It's kind of the latest research on brain science, and what this neuroscientist is saying, is that it's less about the compartmentalized brain. That's maybe that it not she's not saying maybe that's not completely accurate. What it really is how the brain manages energy through survival or connection, and that's from the very first organism that they could study, that was just basically a gut on a stick. And then as things evolved, what she's talking about when you're talking about that is it's also, the more that they focus on success, there's less expenditure of fear energy and protective mode. Protective mode requires a certain amount of, like, it saves kinetic energy when people go into the freeze mode, but it burns all sorts of other energies in the brain. And the brain has to modulate energy consumption, and how the whole body functions. And so what it is when there's less threat, there can be more focus on evolution or successful processing forward. So even if it's not the compartments of the brain as much, the basic construct holds true, as far as if we're not in survival mode, we can thrive more, and the brain will let the body release and move into more thriving mode. So that whole thing about high empathy that can kind of decompress that stress part of the brain, and allow the function to work more towards evolution without this fear of needing to retract all the time. That's how you set up a more growthful process. So it's fascinating to combine kind of the psychological features that we were raised with in the counseling field, with some of the hard brain science side of it. Is like, wow, I can see these parallels starting to come together in the way that I'm looking at this as well. So it was just fascinating to me.
Well, and I think when you offer that, like, right, when they're a little bit further along and they're talking about action and change, and you can help build on that, like being able to provide like psychoeducation on like what's happening in the brain and how that works alongside like the biological responses. It's so reassuring for them to see that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize they had a name for it, or like that makes so much sense, right? And like you see it connect in them, and it's like right language, we're giving them the knowledge that we've learned, but in a way that's super helpful, and that they can walk away going like, I understand what's happening. And it almost kind of weaponizes it in a way of like, here's my shield, here's my sword, right? Like there's the top of the
Yes.
tower, like how do I want to get through like this dragon, kind of thinking about that Snow White. And I find that just so amazing, because it's like you're just giving them all the tools that they need to without inserting yourself in the equation, and just giving them information and building that self.
It's just such I love this reframe of it, because to me, I think then it gets into the heart of why we do the work that we do. It's not about ourselves. And this is what you were talking about, is it's hard because our narratives tend to be more self-centered, even as professionals, and when do we get attention? Nobody gives me attention in my narrative, or the attention that I want in my narrative. And the beauty in MI is the individuals that are identified as needing help, they get the attention they need from their narrative, and it allows them to develop into the person as they define themselves in the most efficient and effective way that we know of as of right now. So this has been awesome. I'm so glad you said yes, you join and jump on the call with me. This is great.
Yeah, thank you. I do appreciate it. I think as we kind of got going, I got a little bit more comfortable, right? It's just like, oh, it's just Casey. I got this. Totally understandable.
So I just want to let everybody listening, if you ever want to jump on, this is my favorite part, is I love talking MI. I don't like to just listen to myself talk about it. It's all these interesting takes and experiences that you all have that, any questions you have, any insights that you have. This is a perfect example of, if you want to jump on and have a conversation with John or me or Danielle or the three of us, whatever, just continue to reach out. I appreciate you listening. Everybody take care. Thanks again, Falin, for coming on.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Communication Solution Podcast with Casey Jackson and John Gilbert. As always, this podcast is about empowering you on your journey to change the world. So if you have questions, suggestions, or ideas, send them our way at casey@ifioc.com. That's CASEY@ifioc.com. For more information or to schedule a training, visit ifioc.com. Until our next Communication Solution Podcast, keep changing the world.